T.S. Eliot, or Thomas Stearns Eliot, Tom to his friends, is arguably the most important English language poet of the 20th century. I talked about Eliot in a few previous videos, one video talking about The Wasteland and one talking about Ash Wednesday. But I wanted to talk about today who Eliot was in general and why we consider him so important when we're thinking about questions of modern poetry. So T.S. Eliot was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, the fact that we would later associate him with the best writing of poetry that was being done in London makes this birth in St. Louis a little bit surprising, I think. But T.S. Eliot, throughout his whole life, was sort of a bundle of contradictions, and it's even something he himself writes about and is interested and kind of forms his poetry, this clashing together of voices, this clashing together of cultures, this clashing together of identities. And I think it was inevitable that America would produce a poet like T.S. Eliot, who, even though he was born and raised in America, became so interested in Europe that he almost tried to make himself into the greatest of European poets, while still always being that boy from St. Louis. T.S. Eliot's career trajectory is very interesting. He went to Harvard University, both for his undergrad and grad school, but he took advantage of studying abroad in both Paris and in Oxford. This was in the first and second decades of the 20th century. And by 1915, T.S. Eliot had basically decided, I don't want to live in America anymore. Even Harvard was not old-fashioned enough for him. He wanted to live in London. And so as World War I started, and as he was actually finishing up his graduate work at Harvard, he decided, I don't want to go back to Harvard, get a PhD, be a professor at an Ivy League college. I want to live in London and write poetry. His day job for most of his life was actually working at a bank, Lloyd's Bank, in London. Now, Eliot beginning his career in London in the teens meant that World War I was very much looming over him. And World War I ends up, I think, shaping a lot of the tension and frightening fragmentation and despair that we see in a lot of his early poems. Eliot's most important early poem, which is published in 1915, is called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It has a very famous beginning. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Starts out with first two lines, which feel very lyrical, almost kind of comically old-fashioned. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky. It rhymes. But that third line, very famously, changes the mood, like a patient etherized on a table. All of a sudden we have someone under anesthesia, presumably about to have surgery done upon them. It's not a romantic or even a lyrical image. And with these three lines in 1915, Eliot announced to the poetry world, hey, I'm here and I'm going to do weird stuff in poetry. Now, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock was first published in America in a Chicago magazine called Poetry, which was a new magazine of avant-garde verse that had been founded by Harriet Monroe just a couple years earlier. And with The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock being published first in Poetry magazine and then making its way across the pond, it very much helped establish Eliot as the new young voice in poetry. We should do another video on literary modernism and how Prufrock kind of kickstarted literary modernism. But for our purposes in this video, I think it's helpful to know that Prufrock really set the stage for the kind of poetry that Eliot would write for the rest of his life. A kind of poetry that would move back and forth between the very old-fashioned and lyrical rhyming verse, let us go then you and I, and very odd, strange, not metrical and not rhyming lines like a patient etherized upon a table. Eliot followed up The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock with his first collection in 1917, which was called Prufrock and Other Observations. Prufrock is still the main poem in that, but there are a handful of other poems that also play with these different voices, where you have this alternating between very free lines of what we now call free verse that are not particularly poetic sounding, often sounding very off-putting, and very highly wrought poetic rhyming lines. In 1920, Eliot would write probably his most formal collection. It's just called Poems 1920. And in Poems 1920, Eliot started experimenting with a very standard hymn style of writing, where you have 4 lines of 4 foot lines. So you have quatrains, 4 lines per stanza, and in each line you have 4 feet. So da 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 da. If you watched my video on St. Ambrose's hymns, this is the Ambrosian hymn style. And Eliot wrote a handful of these poems, and they make up, I think, probably the majority of Poems 1920. But instead of being very pious and straightforward, like Ambrose's hymns, Eliot's poems in Poems 1920 are very cynical. They're very tongue-in-cheek. They're making fun of contemporary Christian culture and the church. They're making fun of contemporary kind of capitalist 20s London. And Eliot was once again, like in Prufrock, showing, yeah, I may write in traditional forms often, but I'm going to have my subjects always be off kilter, always be in critique, or showing the fragmentation and the lack of coherence, maybe lack of moral coherence in particular, that we would look for in, say, the verse of the 19th century, Victorian poetry, for instance. In 1922, Eliot experienced a mental breakdown. This was largely due to a failing marriage, which he had kind of entered into the previous decade against his parents' wishes. He had married a woman named Vivian, who was not faithful to him. He, in turn, was not faithful to her. They both suffered from great mental distress, often bouts of mental illness that were debilitating. And as Eliot was kind of coming out of a particularly difficult mental breakdown, he wrote a poem that ended up being called The Waste Land. And The Waste Land was published in 1922, and you can see my previous video on The Waste Land. It really established Eliot as the preeminent young poet of his generation. He showed that for 3 collections of poetry, from Prufrock to Poems 1920 to The Waste Land, he could write the most exciting, the most troubling, the most innovative poetry that was being published in both America and in Britain in the late teens and early 20s. Often people also read The Waste Land as kind of a statement of despair and of cultural devastation after World War I. But some people have read it more as this is sort of the private musings of a man whose marriage is failing, whose mental illness is acute, who's trying to make sense of the world, which, of course, yes, includes a devastated Europe after World War I. Eliot managed to get even more despairing in his next major poem, which is called The Hollow Men, which is published in 1925. The Hollow Men contains perhaps his most famous lines, the very last lines. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's been quoted hundreds, if not thousands of times in think pieces analyzing everything from interwar Britain to late 20th century, late capitalism, to really, if you want to talk about things failing in a pathetic way, not with a bang, but with a whimper is sort of a shorthand for that. It's a way that Eliot's language has kind of become intrinsic to our English language and how we describe things. If you had been reading Eliot in 1925 and seen The Waste Land and The Hollow Men, you might think this guy is in utter despair. Things are just going to get worse and worse for Eliot. But if you stuck around to 1930, you would have seen a change. I talked in our last video about Ash Wednesday as a poem of conversion. In Ash Wednesday, Eliot chronicles, in his own very idiosyncratic, elusive, poetic way, a turning toward a hopeful new outlook on life. And this outlook is one that was shaped by Anglo-Catholic Christianity. Eliot was not a religious person in his early years, and up through the writing of The Hollow Men, he was not a church attendee. He would not have said that, necessarily he believes in God, let alone the Nicene Creed. But in 1930, he becomes very explicitly Christian, both in his poetry and in his personal life. He started going back to church. He separated from his wife soon afterward. He took a vow of celibacy. So this wasn't, ditching your wife for your younger secretary. He wasn't doing the midlife crisis in a sort of typical disappointing way. He basically said, the life of the married man is not for me. I am going to live a life dedicated to religious devotion, but also to writing poetry. And from 1930 through the mid-1940s, Eliot produces his most mature poetry and his most spiritually, theologically, and philosophically dense poetry. The main poems that he produces in this 15-year period are a series of poems that he ended up calling the Four Quartets. In 1935, it starts with Burnt Norton, and every couple of years and through 1943-44, he publishes a new quartet. These four quartets are poems of 5 sections each. Like his previous poetic output, it goes back and forth between very formal verse, often very formal verse that's satirical of formal poetry, and then very modern and innovative free verse. And so by 1944, when all 4 quartets are collected together and published, Eliot has established himself not just as the new up-and-coming poet like he had in the 20s, but the greatest poet of his generation, a poet who has weathered World War I and World War II, and has come out having produced perhaps the most important body of poetry, certainly of any writer in London at that point, and perhaps any writer in the English-speaking world. Compared to a lot of other poets, say Langston Hughes, who I think rivals him as one of the great modernist poets, Eliot wrote relatively little. Eliot did not want to publish poetry collection after poetry collection after poetry collection. Robert Frost is probably another good example of someone who was a great poet of that generation, but produced maybe 3 or 4 times as much published work as Eliot. Eliot really wanted to crystallize his work into just publishing a little bit of what he wrote and the best of what he wrote. All of this was recognized in 1948 when Eliot was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is the highest literary award in the world that any writer could get. This is a competition not just with English language writers, but of world writers, both novelists and essayists and poets, and Eliot was awarded that in 1948. Eliot kind of turned away from poetry after this. He wrote occasional poems, but he primarily turned to verse drama. And he published from the late 40s through the early 60s, he published a series of verse plays. The Confidential Clerk, The Cocktail Party, The Elder Statesman. Perhaps his most famous play was published in the late 30s, which is Murder in the Cathedral. So we have a real important poet in Eliot, and a man who is speaking to some of the most influential and traumatic events of the 20th century, and really making a mark upon the 20th century, not just in responding to history, but in creating a vocabulary for how we interact with history. So I hope this has given you a good overview of why we care about Eliot. I want to talk a little bit more in subsequent videos about literary modernism and why literary modernism is so important and what modernism and Eliot have to do with each other. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. If you enjoy what we talk about on this channel, go ahead and like and subscribe, support what we're doing. Thanks so much. I've been Dr. Timothy Bartell.